They mocked her as a sinner, bound her in coarse nets like an animal, and dragged her through the dust. A child stirred within her womb, restless under the harsh grip of rope and grit, but no mercy shone in their eyes. She had been cast out, rejected, condemned to die beneath the desert sun. The townsfolk had turned away, spitting judgment in whispers, while the gang of scavengers laughed over her sobs. And yet, at the far edge of the horizon, a lone rider appeared against the blaze of fire-red sky, a shadow moving with unyielding purpose. With each hoofbeat, fate shifted, though neither the outlaws nor the town yet knew it. The heat pressed down like a punishment from God himself, searing the land until the air shimmered above the cracked earth. Vultures wheeled slow in patient circles high overhead, black silhouettes against the merciless sun. The town of Dry Creek stood half buried in dust, its wooden facades warped and faded, its people weary and hardened. It was the late 1800s. The frontier stretched wide and empty, and the line between law and lawlessness was thinner than a knife's edge. The canyon beyond yawned open, its stones glowing red in the afternoon light, and a dry riverbed wound through it like the scar of some old wound. Clara May lay at the heart of it all, tangled in coarse fishing nets, her dress torn, her hair plastered with sweat against her face. She had not cried for herself, not since they dragged her from her shack that morning, but for the life inside her, the child that still kicked, a reminder that she had not been wholly abandoned. Her arms strained against the cords, skin raw, her chest rising in gasps as dust choked her throat. She had once been lovely, with eyes the color of morning skies and a voice soft as spring, but now her cheeks were hollow from weeks of shame and hunger, and her reputation carried heavier weight than her frame. The town had named her sinner, harlot, cursed, and when the Kincaid gang rode in, it was not protection they offered but sport. Jed Kincaid stood over her, his shadow cast long and jagged across her body. His face bore the scars of war and whiskey, one eye clouded, the other sharp and mean. He was a man who had once worn a soldier's coat, but now wore only cruelty. Around him lounged his pack of outlaws, 6 men rough with drink and sun, their laughter loud, their boots kicking up dust as they tossed dice on the ground beside her, gambling over how best to amuse themselves with the bound woman. Their voices carried, coarse and thoughtless. "She's no better than a stray dog." One jeered, spitting tobacco near her cheek. "Dogs don't carry bastards," another retorted, earning a roar of laughter. Jed grinned, kneeling close so Clara could smell the sour stench of whiskey on his breath. "Town don't want you, girl. Guess we'll make sure the desert claims what the good folk won't." Clara turned her face away, pressing her lips together until they bled, refusing to give them her voice. Her stomach clenched as the child within her moved, as though sensing the danger. She whispered a prayer under her breath, not sure if God still listened, but clinging to the thought all the same. The townsfolk stood at the edges of the street, silent watchers in the shade of warped porches. They had gathered as if to a spectacle, yet none dared step forward. Mothers pulled children close, men folded their arms, their eyes shifting away whenever Clara's gaze sought theirs. Fear had worn them thin, and Jed Kincaid's name was enough to silence even the bold. The law in Dry Creek had long since been buried with the last marshal, and in his absence, gangs carved their will into the dust. Clara's breathing grew ragged as she fought the nets, dust coating her tongue until every swallow scraped like sandpaper. The bandits roared with laughter at her struggle, their dice clattering against the ground. One suggested leaving her tied in the canyon for the coyotes. Another bragged of selling her across the border. Each possibility twisted her heart tighter, but still she refused to break. The air shifted. A faint wind stirred through the canyon mouth, carrying with it the scent of sage and distant rain. The horses tethered nearby stamped their hooves, ears flicking uneasily. Jed noticed and frowned, but his men laughed it off, passing the bottle between them. Clara's cheek pressed to the dirt, her eyes closing against the sting of sun and grit. And then, through the haze of heat rising off the horizon, she saw movement, a lone rider cutting across the wasteland, his silhouette sharp against the bleeding sky. He moved steadily, neither hurried nor hesitant, a figure both ghostly and real. The dice froze mid-roll. One outlaw shaded his eyes, Someone's coming, he muttered. Jed squinted, then chuckled darkly. Looks like we got ourselves an audience. The laughter picked up again, harsh and mocking, but thinner now, tinged with something unspoken. Clara's heart pounded. She could not make out the man's face yet, only the dark outline of horse and rider, but hope flickered within her chest like a fragile flame. The vultures wheeled lower, the townfolk shifted in nervous silence, and the gang braced themselves with grins too wide. Dust swirled with each step of the approaching horse, the sound of hooves beating a slow, steady rhythm across the dry earth. Jed spat into the dirt and nudged Clara with his boot. Looks like your luck's changed, girl. Shame it won't be for the better. He raised his voice, calling out across the distance. Hey there, stranger. You best turn that horse around. Ain't no good here but dust and death. The rider did not answer. He kept coming, the sun painting him in firelight, his figure growing clearer with every beat of hooves. The gang jeered, shouting crude words, raising their bottles high. Clara, her body trembling, could only stare, her breath catching in her throat. Something in the way the wind carried that shadow forward told her the world was about to shift. The outlaws laughed, but laughter has a way of faltering when storm clouds gather unseen. And though they did not yet know it, the storm had already arrived. The rider drew nearer, the outline of horse and man etched against the shimmering haze, until details emerged, braided hair glinting with a single eagle feather, a scar curling across his cheek, skin bronzed by sun and storms. His face was quiet, weathered, a mask carved from stone, but his eyes carried the weight of old battles. Whispers had spoken of him in passing years, a Lakota warrior who had once stood against soldiers and vanished after the slaughter at Wounded Knee, a man thought to be dust and memory. Yet here he was, flesh and breath, his presence carrying with it the gravity of a forgotten legend. The horse slowed, hooves crunching dry grit as the stranger entered the circle of jeers. He was no sheriff with a badge, no drifter with quicksilver pistols, but something wholly other, an unexpected force sprung from the very soil the outlaws despised. His weapons were not the polished Colts the gang flaunted, but a bow slung across his back, a short rifle worn with use, and the air of a man carrying ghosts. The town watched with wary awe, as if the desert itself had delivered him, though none dared call out or move closer. Jed Kincaid spat, his mouth twisting in cruel amusement. Well, look what the desert dragged in. A painted savage thinking he's a knight. You lost, Redskin, or you come hunting rabbits. Laughter rippled through the gang, harsh and forced, though unease flickered at the corners of their eyes. The rider did not flinch at the slur. He sat tall in the saddle, gaze steady, voice low but carrying like distant thunder. Let her go. The word silenced even the cicadas for a heartbeat. Clara May lifted her head from the dust, her tear-streaked face catching the light. Her chest heaved, but for the first time since her capture, her eyes held something more than despair. Hope quivered there, fragile as a flame in wind, and it fixed itself on the stranger's steady gaze. He met her eyes with quiet strength, as if promising without words that she would not be left to wolves. Jed barked a laugh, tipping his hat back. Hear that, boys? The Injun wants the girl. His voice dripped with mockery, but his hand brushed close to the revolver at his hip. Tell me, stranger, what's she worth to you? You reckon you can walk in here and start giving orders? The horse stamped once, unsettled by the tension. The warrior, Tahuska, slid down in a single smooth motion, his boots touching earth without raising dust. He stood tall, shoulders broad, bearing the stillness of someone long accustomed to being surrounded. His hand rested loosely near the bow, not drawn, not rushed. She is not yours, he said simply. The gang spat tobacco, muttered curses, shifting like coyotes around a campfire. One kicked Clara in the ribs for emphasis, making her cry out, and the sound echoed sharp in the dead air. Tao's jaw tightened, but he did not move. He only took one step closer, and it was enough to draw their hands to pistols. Boy wants to die. One of them sneered. Best grant him his wish. The world seemed to narrow, heat rising in shimmering waves, the canyon walls holding their breath. Vultures dipped lower, their wings beating slow circles of inevitability. The sun hammered down on sweat-soaked backs, and the air buzzed heavy with the drone of cicadas. The townsfolk remained still as gravestones, too frightened to intervene, too transfixed to turn away. Clara's belly tightened beneath her torn dress, the baby stirring violently as though sensing the storm. She pressed her bound hands to her stomach, whispering a prayer half-formed, half-broken. Jed stepped forward, his boots crunching the earth, revolver dangling easy at his side. His smirk widened. "You think that bow makes you a man? This ain't no hunting ground. Out here, steel talks, and we'll see if you bleed the same." He tilted his head, eyes narrowing. "Go on then. Draw your toy." Tao did not answer. He bent slightly, fingers brushing the fletching of an arrow, slow and deliberate, like a priest handling relics. His movements were ritual, each one measured, unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world. The sun caught the polished wood, making the bow glint briefly, like a shard of lightning waiting to strike. He raised his eyes again, calm, unshaken. Jed barked another laugh, louder now, almost desperate. "This ain't no place for toys, Redskin. Out here, we kill with men's weapons." He lifted his revolver higher, flashing it before his men like a banner of dominance. But even as he laughed, sweat beaded on his brow, and his horse shifted nervously behind him. Clara's heart pounded so hard it hurt. She could feel the moment stretching taut as a rope about to snap, each second swelling with unbearable weight. The stranger's face was unreadable, but his presence was solid, immovable, like the Red Canyon cliffs that loomed above them. The gang circled tighter, spitting into the dirt, their hands twitching near their holsters. A silence thicker than prayer settled, broken only by the harsh cry of a hawk overhead. Tao's voice cut through, low and steady. "This land remembers blood. Yours, mine, theirs. Choose carefully what it takes today." The words rolled across the dust like a curse and a warning both. For the first time, Jed's grin faltered. He sneered quickly to cover it, spitting again. "Killin', you'll be a mercy, savage. But maybe I'll let you watch while we have our fun with her first." He glanced at Clara, and her stomach turned cold while burning her throat. She clutched at her belly, rocking slightly, her whisper breaking into a sob. The child within her kicked again, sharp, insistent, and she gasped, her eyes darting back to Tahu's. He did not move, but the weight in his gaze promised fury to come. The air shimmered, time hung, every breath measured. The outlaws shifted, a ring of predators closing in. Tahu's hand settled on the bowstring, fingers brushing fletching with reverence. His silence spoke louder than any threat. The earth itself seemed to wait for the first strike, the first crack that would shatter the fragile stillness and unleash the storm. The standoff cracked like a brittle bone. One of Jed's men, eager to prove himself, lunged forward with a knife, slashing at the nets binding Clara, not to free her, but to drag her closer into the circle. His grin stretched wide as he reached for her arm. Then a flash cut the air. Tahu moved like lightning, the bow bending in one smooth arc, the string snapping with a hiss. The arrow buried itself through the outlaw's sleeve and deep into the wagon behind him, pinning his arm fast. He howled, twisting in panic, but the warrior's eyes were already elsewhere. The silence shattered. Gunfire erupted, sharp cracks bouncing off the canyon walls. The gang scattered like jackals, pistols blazing, the town erupting in screams as folks scrambled into doorways. Clara rolled to the side, the nets tangling tighter around her arms and legs as she tried to crawl toward the shelter of a trough. She whispered broken prayers between gasps, choking on dust that rose in choking clouds with every pounding boot and ricocheted bullet. Tahu melted into the chaos, his body moving with the precision of someone who had long ago learned that hesitation meant death. He ducked behind a sun-bleached boulder, the bow rising and falling with fluid grace. Arrows whistled one after another, each one finding its mark, not in flesh, but in pistols, hats, and sleeves. He disarmed rather than slaughtered, the shaft striking with uncanny precision. Men cursed as weapons flew from their hands, but anger lent them courage, and more rushed forward. The crack of a revolver split the air, a bullet sparking off stone inches from his ear. Tahu rolled, sand scraping his cheek, and loosed another arrow that sent one outlaw sprawling with the shaft buried through his boot into the dirt. Then, when the press grew too close, he let the bow fall to his side and swung the short rifle from his shoulder. He fired only when the shot was certain, each report deliberate and final. One man clutched his thigh and collapsed. Another's hat flew from his head as the bullet whistled past his ear, sending him fleeing in terror. Clara struggled, teeth gnashing against the rough hemp strands, until her gums bled. Her arms burned with the effort, but the thought of dying here, or worse, the child inside her left to their cruelty, forced her to keep gnawing. The sounds of violence thundered around her, gunfire cracking like dry branches, horses screaming as they panicked, hooves striking sparks on stone. Smoke drifted in golden shafts of sunlight, swirling into ghostly shapes as arrows flashed like fire streaks through the haze. Jed Kincaid bellowed over the din, his revolver spitting fury. He caught Tahu across the side with a grazing shot, tearing through cloth and flesh. The warrior staggered, blood blooming across his ribs, the world narrowing to a red haze. Clara screamed his name, without realizing she had spoken it, her voice raw with terror. Her fingers clawed at the netting, biting harder, finally snapping one thick strand between her teeth. Pain lanced through her jaw, but freedom surged in her chest. Tahu pressed his hand to the wound, his breath harsh, his vision swaying. For a moment, the memory of another day crashed into him. The bodies of his family sprawled beneath soldiers' rifles, the sound of weeping carried on the wind. He had buried them with his own hands, and since then, silence had been his companion. Now, with Jed's mocking laughter ringing in his ears, that silence shattered. Rage poured into his veins, steadying his hands, sharpening his eyes. He rose again, movements deliberate, deadly. A bullet snapped past his temple, close enough to sting. He answered with a rifle shot that shattered the revolver from another outlaw's hand, the man shrieking as metal burned his skin. He swung the butt of the weapon into a charging man's jaw, the crack echoing. The battle became rhythm. Duck, fire, vanish, reappear. His body and the land moved as one, every rock, every shadow his ally. Clara, free at last from the net's grip on her arms, pulled herself upright. Her legs were still tangled, but she grasped a stone slick with sweat and grit. She waited, trembling, until one outlaw loomed over her, sneer carved into his dust-streaked face. With all her strength, she hurled the stone, striking his temple. He reeled, cursing, just as Tahu's arrow streaked across the air and dropped him to the dirt, bloodless but broken. Her heart pounded. She clutched her stomach, whispering to the child inside, "Hold on, just hold on." The dust grew so thick it was as though the earth itself was trying to swallow the fight. Horses reared and screamed, ropes snapped, and the sunlight burned through the haze in jagged shafts. Jed's men faltered, some crawling for cover, others limping away. Only Jed stood firm, his eye bright with madness, his scar twisting as he smiled. The canyon seemed to still for the final reckoning. Tahu emerged from a smoke, chest heaving, blood dripping down his side but his stance unbroken. His bow hung empty, his rifle nearly spent. In his hand, he held only the tomahawk, its blade catching the last of the sun. Jed stepped forward into the clearing, boots crunching on scattered shells. "I killed your kind in the war," he snarled, voice carrying. "Watch them fall, one by one like dogs. You think you scare me? You ain't nothing but another corpse waiting to drop." The words slithered into the silence, venom meant to wound deeper than bullets. Tahu did not answer. His eyes burned, not with fury now, but with a stillness more dangerous than rage. He said nothing, for nothing was needed. Jed lifted his revolver, spinning it once in a showman's flourish. "Come on then, savage. Let's see who the desert keeps." The world seemed to hold its breath. Clara clutched the broken nets around her legs, her voice whispering desperate prayers. The vultures stilled overhead, wings suspended in air. Even the cicadas paused, their drone fading into silence. Jed drew. Tahu's arm snapped forward, the tomahawk spinning through dust and light, the blade whistling as it cut the air. The revolver never fired. Jed staggered back, disbelief frozen on his face as the tomahawk buried itself deep in his chest. His revolver tumbled from nerveless fingers, clattering into the dirt. He stared at Tahu, eyes wide, lips trembling as if to speak, but no words came. Then he crumpled, dust rising in a soft cloud around his body. The silence that followed was absolute. Only Clara's ragged breathing broke it, her sobs turning to laughter edged with hysteria. The gang, what remained of them, scattered into the desert like beaten dogs, leaving their leader cooling in the dust. Tahu stood, chest heaving, blood and sweat streaking his skin, the tomahawk's absence in his hand heavier than its weight had ever been. His gaze lifted to Clara, to the child she shielded with trembling arms, and for a moment, the battlefield faded into nothing but the sound of her heart still beating, her child still alive. The dust settled in slow spirals, drifting over the broken shapes of men who had once swaggered like kings. Some lay groaning, clutching their wounds. Others had fled into the canyon shadows, their courage gone with their leader. Jed Kincaid's body rested in the dirt, his revolver cooling beside a hand that would never again reach for it. The afternoon sun hung low, turning the dust into strands of gold, and silence returned like a heavy blanket. What moments before had been a storm of violence now stood still, waiting for breath to return. Clara lay on her side, her chest rising and falling with shuddering sobs, each one pulled from a body still trembling with terror. The nets clung to her legs, cutting into her skin, but she hardly noticed. All she felt was the pounding of her heart, the ache in her throat, and the life inside her pressing strong against her ribs, as if reminding her that both had survived. She blinked through tears, her gaze finding the figure who had stood against the gang, a silhouette of strength outlined by fading light. Tahu stepped forward slowly, his steps steady despite the blood that darkened his shirt at the ribs. The tomahawk was gone from his hand, buried where it belonged, but his presence carried a weight heavier than any weapon. Without a word, he knelt beside her, his fingers sure and gentle as he pulled at the coarse knots. The rough fibers loosened, snapping under his calloused grip until the nets fell away in coils of dust-stained rope. Clara's arms came free, and with them came a sob so deep it seemed to shake her whole body. Her hand shot out, clutching his arm, gripping with a desperation born of fear and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, voice breaking like fragile glass. She searched his eyes for something, mercy, kindness, maybe even a name. He said nothing, but his gaze held her steady, unspoken truths glimmering there like embers, not yet cooled. In the stillness between them, words seemed unnecessary. The town began to stir on the edges of the street, timid figures peering out from the shadows of porches. They whispered to each other, but did not step forward. Fear still gripped them, and shame too, for they had stood idle while cruelty unfolded before them. Yet their eyes lingered on the warrior and the woman, as though trying to understand what story was being written in dust and blood before their eyes. Clara shifted, pushing herself upright. Her dress hung in tatters, her hair a snarl of dust and sweat, but she stood with her hand braced against her belly, dignity slowly returning to her bearing. She studied Tahu, tilting her head as if trying to place a memory that fluttered at the edges of her thoughts. Then it came to her, a flicker of recognition that turned her breath sharp. "My husband," she murmured. "You knew him, didn't you? Samuel. He traded with your people." Tahu's eyes softened, though his face remained solemn. He nodded once. "Samuel brought us food when others turned us away. He shared fire and did not ask for payment. He said kindness needed no coin." His voice was low, almost reverent, carrying the weight of years. "When soldiers came, he stood with us. I fought beside him. He was brave." Clara's throat tightened, tears springing fresh. Samuel had been gone for 2 winters now, claimed by fever that no medicine had cured. Yet here stood the proof that his spirit lingered, that the kindness he had shown had not vanished with his body. She placed a trembling hand against her belly, feeling the child shift again, and whispered, "He would be grateful for what you've done." Tahu looked away briefly, the canyon wind tugging at the feather tied in his hair. "I owed him a debt," he said quietly. "This was my way of honoring it. And perhaps," his words trailed, his jaw tightening, "perhaps of finding peace for my own." The admission hung between them, heavy and unpolished. She sensed the shadows that haunted him, The losses he carried like stones in his heart, though he did not speak them. His silence told enough. Clara's own grief rose to meet his, uniting them in a bond neither had expected. The canyon grew quiet as the sun dipped lower, spilling long beams of amber light across the desert floor. The vultures had drifted away, finding no feast in the wake of the fight, and the cicadas had softened their song. The air smelled of smoke and blood, but beneath it was the faint sweetness of sage carried on the evening breeze. Clara stood straighter now, no longer just a victim in nets, but a mother whose hope had been restored. Her eyes, red from weeping, shone with a steadiness that had not been there before. Tahu moved toward his horse, each step leaving a faint print in the dust. The animal whickered softly, nudging his shoulder as if urging him to mount and move on. He tightened the reins, ready to disappear back into the horizon that had birthed him. Clara took a hesitant step forward, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "Wait!" Her voice carried, thin but clear in the quiet. He paused, turning his head slightly, the fading light casting half his face in gold. "Tell me your name," she said, "so I can remember who it was that saved me." For a moment, silence stretched. His gaze drifted to the canyon walls, then back to her. A faint smile ghosted across his lips, brief as a shadow. "No name worth remembering," he said softly. "Only deeds." With that, he mounted in one fluid motion, the horse turning toward the horizon. Dust rose beneath its hooves, curling upward, like smoke from an old prayer carried skyward. He did not look back, and soon his figure blurred into the distance, swallowed by the vastness of the frontier. Clara stood where he had left her, one hand pressed to her belly, the other clutching at the ragged edge of her dress. The evening light bathed her in gold, the canyon around her glowing with quiet majesty. She was alone, yet no longer broken. A new strength burned within her, born of survival and the knowledge that justice had not abandoned her. She would carry that strength into tomorrow, into motherhood, into every step of her life beyond this day. And though the townsfolk whispered, though they hung their heads in shame for their silence, Clara would remember differently. She would remember the shadow that rose against cruelty, the man who bore grief but chose to defend instead of destroy, and the way the world seemed to hold its breath the moment he arrived. She would tell her child one day, when the time was right, of the warrior who had risked everything to set them free. They said she was bound and broken, cast aside like a burden. Yet in her darkest hour, a Lakota warrior rose from the dust to fight for her freedom. Some call it fate, others call it justice. But long after the gunsmoke cleared and the outlaws lay silent, folks whispered of the day when a man with no name staked his life on the worth of a woman the world had thrown away. And so a legend was born, not of blood spilled, but of freedom reclaimed beneath the wide, unending sky.